Sometime in 2013, I had written the Syrians through a contact that I found in the press office to ask for an interview with President Assad. And I didn't hear anything back from them for the next 2 years, nor did I pursue things. Until about 10 days ago, so a week or so before the actual interview, I got a phone call at about 6:30 in the morning as I was in the kitchen making coffee, which I didn't answer because I didn't recognize the area code, which turned out to be Syrian. I got a second call, which I didn't answer. But when I looked at my email a few minutes later, I found an urgent request from the press office of the presidency of the Republic of Syria saying, "Can you please call us?" I called and spoke to the woman who would become my contact in the press office, who said, "We were just going through our outstanding press requests from the previous year. Yours came to the top and we were wondering if you were still interested." I said, "Of course I was." Then the next question was, "Can you be here in 5 days?" The timing is all about the recent terrorist attacks in Paris. Since the beginning of the war, the Assad government's consistent refrain has been, "We are a bulwark of secularism in the Middle East, fighting the same enemies that you're fighting, namely Islamic extremism, and we should be your allies. We're not the bad guys, they're the bad guys." And so this spectacular attack in Paris gave them, they felt, an opportunity to make that argument yet again at a time when they hoped the West would be particularly receptive to making new friends in that fight. The reason that we decided to do it is, at Foreign Affairs, we're committed to the idea of giving our readers as much access as possible to as broad a range of ideas as possible. So the irony is that getting into Syria is relatively easy for the simple reason that nobody wants to get into a war zone. It was getting out that would prove much more difficult. The simplest thing to do was to fly into Beirut and then travel overland. It's not a long journey. It's only about 130 kilometers, and there are a lot of people who go back and forth every day. So what I did was fly into Beirut airport, spend the night there, and then arrange through a contact for a Syrian to pick me up at my hotel and drive me across the border. As I entered Damascus, I was quite struck to see that for all the security precautions, all major buildings are now ringed with blast walls and have pillbox gun turrets, and soldiers in uniform and out are everywhere. Despite all of that, the city feels like it's going about its business as though there's no war going on 20 kilometers away. The morning of the interview, I was driven by my handler and government driver in a small beat-up South Korean sedan up to the People's Palace, as it's called, which is the administrative offices of the Syrian presidency. A huge, squat, rectilinear, modernist building perched on one of the many mountains that ring the city of Damascus. You enter the vast complex and go through fairly minimal security. I went through a metal detector and our car was screened by bombs. No uniformed soldiers at the gate, just a few guys wearing business suits. And then we drove into the grounds, which are vast. The People's Palace is surrounded by Park Lane and has about an 8-lane monumental highway driving up to the building itself, which was completely empty the entire time that we were there. It felt like very much like what pictures of North Korea look like. Huge spaces designed to intimidate, with not a living soul to be seen. Drove up to a side door of the palace, entered the building, which was enormous and completely unheated. The lights were off in most of the areas. Of course, the lack of heat and lights were explained to me as a sign not of biting economic sanctions, but as a commitment by Assad to environmentalism. The president met me at the door with a big smile and a handshake, and we went into his very well-appointed, very modern office with a huge, brand new Macintosh computer on his desk, and most incongruously a wooden sculpture or statue of Westminster Abbey and Big Ben sitting on the sideboard. The president seemed extremely relaxed and well briefed through our interview, which is part of what gave rise to this sense that either there's something wrong with him on a fundamental level, because why else could a man who is whose country is burning down around his ears and is in the process of destroying it seem so utterly, blithely complacent or satisfied about the state of things. Assad very effectively would combine completely either delusional or false statements, we are winning the war, with completely reasonable statements like, but of course war is a terrible thing, so even if we win it in a technical sense, we will lose it in other senses. And that's part of what makes him such an effectively devious interlocutor, I think, is that by conjoining something that everyone would agree with something that no one would agree with, the juxtaposition makes the irrational part start to seem a lot more rational. You catch yourself almost nodding along to what he's saying, and it's very easy to forget two things, for an instance. One, that much of what he's saying is totally fabricated, and two, that you're speaking to a total monster who is committed and continues to commit barbaric, heinous crimes on his population and has blood on his hands. We have an image in our mind of what a bloodthirsty dictator should look like, and that image is not a very slightly shy, giggly, British-trained ophthalmologist with a high voice and a nice accent who treats you with impeccable manners and offers you cappuccino. So it turns out, and it stands to reason, that entering a war zone is a lot easier than leaving one. As smooth as my trip into Syria was, that's how difficult my taking was. Our first obstacle came when we hit one of the military checkpoints outside the city, and Damascus was ringed by 3 or 4 of them, manned by some very twitchy young soldiers swinging Kalashnikovs in various states of spit and polish in uniform. They went through my luggage, they took away my passport, and they still weren't mollified. And so we had to spend about 25 minutes at the side of the road with a few trucks of farmers who had their produce getting ripped apart until the soldiers were satisfied that we weren't a threat or simply got bored, at which point they handed it to us. But the trouble really began when we got to the Lebanese border post. The scene at the border was absolute bedlam. There's only one crossing for the entire, for civilians to go from Damascus, or from Syria, I should say, into Lebanon. And there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of Syrians trying to get out of the country every day. As a consequence, the border post is completely overwhelmed. The border post was the entry point into the Bekaa Valley, which is what leads to the pretty much all the way to the city of Beirut. My driver had told me that there are a lot of bandits who try and force cars to the side of the road, and so he told me several times it was very important that we get through the road and all the way to Damascus before dark. So when I looked at my watch and noticed that it was about 3:30 and remembered that the sun started setting at 4:30, I started getting a little anxious. At that point, I do that thing that you've seen in war movies that I've never imagined myself doing, and certainly have never wanted to, where the American journalist shows up at an overwhelmed border crossing with a lot of miserable people trying to get from one side to the other, sticks his passport into the air and starts yelling at the top of his lungs, "I'm an American, let me speak to the person in charge." And lo and behold, that's what we did, and it worked. All told, it took us about 12 hours to get from one capital to the other, a drive of 130 or 40 kilometers or so. I think there are 2 or 3 things that foreign affairs readers should take away for the interview. The first is for Assad's very effective facade of rationality and reasonableness. this is a profoundly unreasonable person who is either in deep denial to an extent that suggests serious psychological issues, or he is extremely and unhesitatingly deceptive and mendacious. The second is that he is utterly unrepentant about everything that's happened in this. In 4 years of horrible fighting, and the incredibly long catalog of abuses of his government for which he's directly responsible. And the third is that he is as rigid and as inflexible as he's been from the very beginning. And I think that's especially important because you've started to hear, one hears a lot of hopeful argument, I think, in the West these days that some sort of a political accommodation, compromise can be struck with the Syrian government. The Assad that I met during our hour together left me utterly convinced that that's a complete fantasy, that he will never do anything to yield power. He will not make any concessions to either the West or to the rebels, and that the war will end in one of two ways. Either he crushes the opposition or the opposition crushes him, and he ends up either strung up by his feet or in the dock in The Hague.